very quickly through these. First of all, I've got 7 good reasons in addition to some of the ones that Chandrika outlined earlier this morning. First of all, because a human rights focus aligns well with the trend in wider development policy. We've got the momentum that we can use here. If we don't, we kind of miss out and we're stuck in the 1980s, 1990s, stabilised, privatised, liberalised world, where it's all about market fundamentalism, essentially. SIDS has gone in fishery development programs recently, including fish flow in national poverty reduction strategy planning, making sure that they're not forgotten when those plans are drawn up. And there are the Millennium Development Goals, focusing us on the reduction of poverty and hunger. And there is this strong emerging focus of rights within parts of the UN and international organisation system, primarily kicked off through the UNDP World Development Report of 2000, which focused exclusively on human rights. Second reason is because political and civic rights are related to economic, social and cultural rights, and I think that's illustrated most powerfully, again, with reference to Amartya Sen's work on famines. And no substantial famine has ever occurred. In other words, no extreme failure of economic rights has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a relatively free press. So where the response of a government to acute suffering often depends on the pressure that is put on it, is where the exercise of political rights can make a real difference. The right to vote, to criticise, to petition and to protest. And many of you in this room have exercised those rights to great effect. The third reason is because there's an existing legal and policy framework in almost all the states, and Chandrika has dealt with this, so I won't elaborate. But there are key instruments to protect vulnerable people within society, specifically. The conventions on women, on rights of the child, migrants, a lot of fishing people are migrants. There's been a great emphasis on the strength of fishing communities and how community solidarity plays such an important part in what you're trying to achieve here. But let's spare a thought for people who are a long way from their communities, often working illegally in countries that are not their own. And then there are the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Rights, decent work. The fourth reason is that because human rights approaches are also becoming widely used in other sectors, they have growing legitimacy. FAO itself has adopted the right to food. It has explicitly adopted a human rights framework for its primary mission, which is to alleviate hunger. It shouldn't be such a big step for FAO to also adopt a human rights approach to fisheries. Rights to water have been discussed. They were left out of the original Human Rights Declaration, which talked about food, shelter, food, housing, and health, but forgot to mention water, which has caused human rights lawyers all kinds of problems since. The importance of rights in disaster relief context, I think, was strongly illustrated in the 2004 Asian tsunami, where vulnerable people failed to gain some of the support from disaster relief efforts, failure of basic rights. And the focus on rights-based approaches in disaster relief has increased as a result of that sad experience. And in primary health care, there is an emphasis on people's rights to decent health. Fifth reason is because it fits very well with existing rural development and self-help initiatives, the kinds of things that NGOs, development agencies, communities themselves do in order to find their own routes out of poverty. Whether it's income and asset poverty or vulnerability or dealing with social exclusion. There are many rights-based potential entry points to dealing with these issues. The sixth reason is because it fits very well in the context of responsible fisheries and ecosystem-based management. The existing mainstream frameworks that FAO takes the lead on in terms of its policy influence on the way that fisheries are governed. All of us, I think, in this room are trying to do, to a greater or lesser extent, one of the things in that central box. The question is, how do we prevent overfishing while supporting livelihood interests and while continuing to ensure that the fisheries sector contributes to wider poverty reduction and food security? And we may have different emphases, we may have different ideas on how that's done, but pretty much that's what we're all here trying to do. And there are several existing ways of doing this. Our stock assessment scientists and biologists provide, and local knowledge also inputs into this, information on resource status, environmental status, to guide fishery management. We're making attempts to reform fisheries governance, both grassroots social movements to achieve that, and technical support interventions from a range of agencies. We're trying to help connect people to markets in more equitable ways and bring benefits of technologies to marginalised and vulnerable people. And mobile phone usage and its connection to fishing communities is one good example. And there are direct efforts to build people's assets and capability. To this, we merely add directed efforts to reduce vulnerability and strengthen rights. It's very much part of the framework for addressing responsible fisheries and ecosystem-based management. There's no conflict, in my mind, between these things. The last reason for adopting a human rights approach is because it can be very, very effective. In human rights and trade, for example, banning the sale of conflict diamonds was very much argued on the basis of a human rights platform. And we've seen also efforts in the fisheries sector, regulating shrimp production standards by drawing attention to human rights violation in processing. There are also instances where human rights have been used to secure a safe living and working environment. And the case of the Pakistani High Court, which ruled against its own government plans to dump nuclear waste in coastal waters on the grounds that this would violate coastal citizens' right to a healthy living and working environment. And lately there are challenges to human rights in a climate mitigation context, where the growing of biofuels in poor countries to offset rich country carbon emissions has been challenged on the grounds that it violates or potentially violates the right to food. The case against the human rights approach, well, I'll let you argue that this afternoon, so I won't go into it now. Suffice to say that I think there are valid counter-arguments to all of these. And I think the last one, if it gets all nasty and political, well, good. I think it's about time we got angry about this stuff. Finally, how to put all this into practice. Enrique outlined this morning some of the specific ways in which particular rights can be used to implement this overall rights framework. I want to distill down what fishery management and development accounts to in these three main categories. The threats that fishery systems are under arise from market failures of various kinds, governance failures, resource governance in particular, and entitlements failures of rights. And if we look at the themes of this conference, yesterday we looked at markets and the consequences of market failures and how to respond to them, how to strengthen markets, how to improve them. On the first day we looked at governance failures and how to respond to those with better resource management strategies, including rights-based fishing. And today we've looked at entitlements failures, where people are not getting what they're legally entitled to under human rights law. So my guess is that a focus on entitlements failures, the adoption of a human rights underpinning to fisheries development and governance, isn't replacing market and governance, focused on dealing with market and governance failure. It's supplementing it, it's underpinning it. And I'll just give one example of how that might help. If you have a project that aims to connect people with global markets, for example. We heard a lot about that controversially yesterday. If there are attempts to connect a small-scale fishery to a global market, then